Shing-a-ding-a-ding-a-ding-ding-doo. We'll overlay that with the actual soundbite and see how racist I sound. Speaking of, welcome to a video of a white guy talking about the Poppy War and the Sword of Kaigen, respectively by R.F. Kuang and M.L. Wang. And I say Asian literature, there should be a little asterisk there. These aren't literally books from China or Japan, as the Poppy War is the story of a fictional China in combat with a fictional fantasy Japan, where the Sword of Kaigen is the story of a fictional Japan, and the main enemy is Japan. So some historically accurate villainization there, going back to World War II at least. And the Poppy War, in particular, marks, I think, a shift in the sort of public consumption of literature in terms of the brick and mortar stores, the popular like name brand fiction, where you're seeing a lot more less Western culture and so a lot of Asian culture, especially at the filming of this video. The Poppy War, when it first came out, it was sort of staying on its own a bit more, but now you have East Asia, you're having some Africa, and it's sort of free real estate. If you're writing in the sort of Western fantasy tradition, it's been done to death. You really have to find a new and unique niche if you're going to do something interesting or novel in a way. But really, there hasn't been a lot of popular literature that pulls from Chinese mythos, Chinese fantasy stories, for example. So it's a lot easier. The bar is lower for authors, because I can't say whether or not these authors have been writing these stories all along, but in the very least, traditional Western publishing has picked up on that more. I say that with an exception here, because the Sword of Kaigen, which is going to be the counterpoint to the Poppy War we're going to be talking about, is actually self-published, and it's one of the best self-published stories I think I've ever read. And they're very, very different. I've always had issues with having to talk about spoilers, and I guess I'm just going to go with personally what feels right to me from now on, where if it's kind of an obvious spoiler, or like in the case of the Poppy War, the title, yeah, halfway through there's a Poppy War. So I don't consider that a spoiler, and if it affects material enjoyment of the story, I'm not going to treat it as a spoiler. Sword of Kaigen, I can't really talk about the plot too much, because it's you have no idea where the story's going, and it's sort of fantastic in that way. But and I know I always talk about web novel or just sort of the more amateur writing on this channel a lot. And that's something I've seen a lot. I do a lot of sort of editing swaps in a more professional sphere, and there's a lot more Chinese writers specifically. In the internet space, like wuxia, pronunciation, I don't know, has been popular a lot, but even like just more like traditional Chinese writing, almost like Three Kingdoms style. And I find it really enjoyable. It's a breath of fresh air regardless of what it is, because there's just a lot of quality writing out there in this sort of atmosphere, in the ether. That's what we call it, the ether sphere. That doesn't make sense. There's a lot of quality writing out there in the ether that's not necessarily penetrated the public consciousness quite yet. So I'm excited to see how it develops over the next couple of years. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about the Poppy War, which sort of, I don't want to say it kickstarted it all, because that's a huge claim, but this was a major tentpole book in terms of popularity. Time did like a top 200 fantasy stories of all time, and the Poppy War and one of its sequels was on that. It's a trilogy that has a lot of eyes on it, and for better or worse, a lot of people like into it, I would say. It hasn't had that cultural conversion where people are getting like bumper stickers and t-shirts, but it's a major fantasy story. The first chapter, starting off, we're going to do this in 3 sections. The first chapter, the first half, and the second half. Less spoilers as we go through. The first chapter is something I reference all the time to newer writers, because in theory, it's a really boring idea, but executed in the best way possible. The first chapter is just the character takes a test, which you see a lot. You see a lot of new authors just say, test. I think it's a crutch for newer or lesser authors to need some sort of bombastic start to pull the reader in. When the reality is, as long as you just have a solid structure to the chapter and really good character beats, that is what's going to make it a fantastic first chapter. And this chapter also establishes right away another thing that I think is going to be a major modern trend as we go forward the next decade, which is very stiff cardboard-like prose. Sanderson, the Brandon Sanderson, has established that readers will buy tons of books with I don't know, do we want to call it subpar? With pretty inadequate prose for prose being an art form. Guilty as charged. I have plenty of his books as well. And I think Poppy War is even one step under Sanderson, where it's cardboard-esque oftentimes, but it's the bare minimum, which is to its advantage, especially in a book like The Poppy War, which is first and foremost a crowd pleaser, because it's accessible. You can sit down and read 50 pages at a time and not feel exhausted. At the intersection of popularity and depth of prose, I honestly think like A Song of Ice and Fire series is the one. I could never read more than 25 pages of Martin at a time. And that's not a critique. It's really, really well written. I think he's a phenomenal writer, and I love his style. But it's just there's an energy that when you're reading his work, it requires. Where here, you could get energy back from the universe. Right away, the stakes are high. Our main character is Fang Runin, or most of the time just Rin, and she's adopted into a poor sort of fantasy China, and I just can't say how much. It is literally just China, but fantasy. Here's the map. And she's going to be married off to a fat, ugly old man. And her one way out of it is to pass the national exam and get accepted to the military academy. And to do so, she goes through drastic masochistic measures to pass that test. I would like to say that sets the tone for the book, because there is masochism and self-harm to a degree as like a pragmatic function. And if you read what people have said about this, I've seen it in like magazines, I've seen it in comment sections, etc. It's sometimes characterized as grim dark, which there are justifications for, but also no. If you cut about like 10 pages from the book, tonally and execution-wise, it reads almost like a YA book. So I would call this book just a very easy-to-read adult fiction, because it often reads almost like, I don't know, book 5 of Harry Potter, not even the later, not even the oldest ones, but just sort of like sentence-wise, maturity-wise. But then you have those moments that really kick it up a notch, and we're going to get into one specific moment, which I would applaud this book for towards the end. But as the first act unfolds, it is nothing but cliches. This is a patchwork of cliches. I haven't watched the show in the past decade. I just recall seeing the first 2 seasons of American Horror Story, and that's what that show was just, let's take 10 movies or television tropes and just put them all together and see what happens. There is a real phoniness to the Chinese culture that we're getting that is just immediately palpable to me. There's details. I've never been to China. Somehow, out of everyone I know, I'm the only one who's never gone to China. So just everything I know is secondhand. But this book feels like a collection of secondhand information about China, as if it was written by someone who has never lived there and never been there in any substantial capacity, which this is the UK writer majoring in Chinese history, and my research shows that yes, she has been there, but I'm just going to say generally that it feels phony. I'm not up to date on the Reddit meta. I know back in like, I don't know, a decade ago, there used to be like a popular like Ask Reddit, and people would go on there like, what are some surprising facts about China? And like this book is just a list of popular things about China that people kind of know and talk about in a sort of second-hand way. Oh, don't get hit by a rickshaw because of a lawsuit, so they'll try and kill you. Oh, don't eat from the soup vendors because they'll literally dip their ladle in the gutter to pull out fat and cook the soup with. Like, both of these things are things I've heard of secondhand. This is the level of culture building and world building that the author is delivering, I feel like it's a problem when someone who really has no primary level of knowledge about a country seems to have the same level of knowledge as the writer does. But like outside of like things you've learned in a Chinese history at Georgetown University, it feels superficial. The first half here is Harry Potter, Chinese fantasy. There's a whole bunch of Name of the Wind going on. It is a collection of tropes that you've seen before. Every single chapter is going to feel like something you've read before. And yet, in terms of overall quality, the first half of this book excels at being incredibly entertaining because you have the through line of this main character is trying to work through like social exclusion. There's a big tournament, so you always have like a goal on the horizon. We talk so much about originality in writing. Enjoyment really just needs a solid execution with some surprises, and being able to rearrange what you've already read before is a form of surprise. I mean, listen, there's fantasy Hermione in this book. There's fantasy Draco Malfoy just overtly, and it's all great. The midway point of the book is the titular Poppy War, which if it wasn't in the title, I wouldn't spoil that, but it's literally the title, so what do you want me to do about that? And this is where the book goes downhill in quality because it loses any semblance of through line or structure. It's really muddled. Most of the book takes place in the second act, takes place in a single city under siege, and like in terms of like a military novel, there's no sensible movement, there's no sensible progression. They'll randomly just go out and do a mission, and it's a muddled mess, which is further muddled by certain choices. There is a character death, which when it happened, I applauded, and then the author undid it. I said, well, that sucks, but okay, I understood it. It was an audacious choice, but okay, you're undoing it. Never in my life have I seen an author fake out the same character death in the same novel. The same character who should have died the first time, it happens again. It happens again. It's the fact that they did it the first time is rough, and the second time, you're just like, are you kidding me? It's one of the most audaciously horrible choices I've ever seen in a novel. And if you've read further on, you probably have some comments about that. And I plan on following up with the Poppy Wars sequels, so we'll talk about that. There is a reason the author did that, but narratively, in terms of how you're supposed to read it, it's just it's a baffling decision. And the second act, as we progress, really deals a lot with the magic system, which was established in the first half. The magic system is fun. It feels mystical, and it draws you in, and it's like, well, maybe I could achieve this in real life. You know, if I just get high and meditate enough, I too can transcend and learn something about our greater existence. Which is good that it does work, because ultimately the novel hinges on the magic system. But for me, the most interesting thing is the war aspect between fantasy Japan and fantasy China, which culminates in what is essentially the rape of Nanking, which, if you don't know, that is a historical event, and I'm sure just saying that, YouTube's going to get pissy at me, but I'm not monetized. I don't care. I'll say all the what were the gamer words? I'll say all the gamer words. The book, in very explicit detail, for a short section, just lists all the war crimes that did occur, and it's not me guessing. There are certain other aspects when you get into sort of the men behind the sun stuff towards the end of the book, where it's very clearly a condemnation on World War II Japan, and just shining a light on that. And I don't think, especially in the Western Hemisphere, I don't think that's a thing a lot of people are familiar with. Oh, the Nazis were so bad, etc., etc. When in reality, the Nazis were industrialized. They were machinists of the inhuman. I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say the Japanese were worse. They just were worse at doing it on a larger scale. The really heinous stuff that happened in real life, the book sort of glosses over, and it's a weird inclusion. If you're not up to date on your World War II history and just like what happened with that unit, then it almost feels like a detour. But that's and it's weird to talk about because the second half of the book is so sloppy and so over the place, but but there's these bright and shining moments that are better than anything else in the book. So there's a lot to love here, and the parts that are more audacious, the better it is, which includes the climax. It's a fantastic climax that brings the book together and really cements sort of the darker tone in the themes, which it often stumbled, but it crosses the finish line. So I'm going to give The Poppy War a 7 out of 10. It's close. It's closer to being higher. For all its faults and all its unoriginality, it's a super enjoyable book. But here's the huge asterisk. Would I recommend that you read The Poppy War? Probably not, because it's a trilogy. The Poppy War is a trilogy. And if you're like me and you read a good book and you want to read more, or you even feel compelled to read more, I can't recommend this. If you can pick up The Poppy War and just say, that's it, I'm done, there's some loose plot threads. There's some stuff that happens, some characters do things that make no sense, and the author's baiting that line. They're saying, come back and see, it's gonna be crazy. So if you can let that go, then you can read the book. But I'm going to say, any other circumstance, as a series, I would not recommend the Poppy War trilogy. I think its sequels are some of the worst sequels in fiction. I don't say that. That's not a bit. I'm not being inflammatory for inflammatory's sake. I am going to follow up on this and explain exactly what I mean in excruciating details. The third book, I don't know which one's worse, whether it's the second book, The Dragon Republic, or the third book, The Burning God. It was the third book specifically that turned me into a note taker. I now sit with a notepad when reading books because that book made me do it. I needed citations. Because this is a series that seems to be well regarded as a series. The Times 200 list I mentioned one of those sequels as one of the best fantasy books ever written, and I'm just like, do I have a hole in my head? Am I the crazy one? They're bad. They're bad. I think they're controversial at some degree because maybe it leans into the darker aspect, but I'm not even talking about that, man. I mean like basic third grade level execution of a story. The author varies between being bored and like literally forgetting what they wrote in the last page. And that's not an exaggeration. I literally have a citation where the author forgot what they wrote on the last page. Very rarely can you insult a book by saying it's so bad that the editor is now implicated, but I would implicate the editor in the sequels as well. Like, more than one person was not doing their job. So we'll see how much I cut that down. For a truly, truly lovely, lovely palate cleanser, The Sword of Kaigen, I will just say out the gate, this is one of my favorite fantasy books from the last decade. It's self-published. It's you can still find like the audiobooks on Audible. Amazon is selling copies of this. So if you just Google it, you're gonna maybe find that, it's not necessarily being sold, but it's out there. You can get it, and you can probably get it cheaper than most books. And a lot of the magic that we see early on is just very overtly just about ice and the manipulation of ice. That, I guess that in of itself is a spoiler because I didn't realize it was a 4-element story until later on. It doesn't hide it. It's just so hyper specific on ice magic essentially that you didn't realize there was more. Story itself, and we're not even gonna go past the first act here. Just the premise and the overall feeling it gives you. The story is about, I'm just gonna read it off because I can't remember all these names off here. The story starts off with Mamoru Matsuda, who's essentially the heir to the Matsuda daimyo, this lineage that serves the shogun in fantasy Japan, and he's going to school, and a newcomer from out in the world who's seen the world is also now enrolled in school, and he brings some new ideas that's making him question his country and his political leaders, which in turn makes him question his father and their family's role in society. It's fairly basic stuff, and I'm not even going to say it starts out well executed, but where it immediately gets interesting is that every now and then we get cuts to scenes at his house where his mother is like just rocking in a chair and sewing. His mother is feeding the baby with her sister who just had a baby. And even though it's just like, it's really low energy chapters of like just these women, it's so interesting and so enthralling comparatively that I just sat here wishing like, man, I kind of wish this was the mother's book. I kind of wish this was a story about the mother rather than this little kid. And as the book goes on, it evolves. And maybe this was the author's plan, or maybe they discovered it while writing, where yeah, this mother is the more interesting character. Instead of having a traditional fantasy chosen one story, which it feels like that is overtly what we're going for, it evolves into a story about the mother of the chosen one. And I'm using chosen one there roughly. It's not a literal chosen one story, even though it seems like it's going to be structured that way. But it follows the mother of the chosen one and her son's new knowledge about the family's position in the politics starts to be creating a rift between her and her husband. That the rift was already there, but now it's getting worse. Like, you think the story starts off going one way, and then not even halfway through the first act, like we start talking about like domestic violence and spousal abuse, and it starts going in a very weird direction from what you'd expect, which is why I just can't talk about the plot of this book, because my goodness, the ground this story covers. It's not a short book. Like, we're like 600 pages plus here, and it feels even longer than that, because there's so much happens, so much is developed, and oftentimes it's done in such a mature way. Even for some of the bigger bombastic scenes, when handled by another author, would just be like just such an explosion of like wanting to root for the characters and being like, yeah, get them. It's almost met with a melancholy, or the author just like adding that little twist of the dagger at the end. Like, you can have your excitement, but we're also going to like explore this in a realistic way, or a mature way, or just a way that's bittersweet. There's no easy answers, and there's no easy wins to the development of these characters, whether that be this plays out how you would probably expect in the vein of a normal fantasy novel. This is, in a lot of ways, this is probably a story that couldn't be published in a mass markety agent publisher scenario. Not necessarily because of the quality. I mean, just one editing pass, you're there. The corporate-y kind of people who like pick out just the lowest common denominator stories would just assume this wouldn't have traction, which is, and maybe I'm wrong. I really wish I was wrong, but the end result is wow. That's my review. Wow, I'm giving it a 9 out of 10, and it's crazy to say 9 out of 10 because that's close to perfection. Especially if you've seen like my reviews and my numbers I give books, which I'm all for not judging books with a number, but I'm sort of anal about this, and I have a very strict categorization system. There are chapters in here that don't work, but it doesn't matter because they're doing so many other things well. You can excuse just a page where a character sits in a classroom and learns world building. Literally a whole chapter where they just get out their notepad and learn world building, which you just shouldn't do. But it doesn't inhibit the overall enjoyment. You still take away those big moments. You still take away so much good writing. Not necessarily prose writing. Prose-wise, it's the prose is pretty bland, but in a very different way from what I would consider to be the Poppy Ward's more cardboard texture. It's just in that it doesn't have that shine, it doesn't have that polish. It's an independent author who's written a lot, but I don't know how much time they have to write. Let's just assume they don't have another job. This is their business. Then you still have to punch those out pretty fast. So it's fine. The prose is serviceable. The one thing I will say though, and I don't think we'll probably never talk about this again, but I actually started by listening to the audiobook, which I don't recommend. The audiobook is really, really bad. The audiobook is going to put you to sleep a little bit. I had to give up at a certain point, and I went and just bought the book, which do. I mean, if ever there was a time to support independent authors, like, support them when they deliver something that is masterclass. I mean, it benefits all of us for more things like this to be created, whether it's from M.L. Wang or from someone else. Like, they wake up one day choosing, do I want to do professional publishing? Do I want to do self-publishing? And then they see the sales numbers from M.L. Wang and say, man, independent publishing. It's good for competition. It's good for the industry. It's good for the market. It's good for your enjoyment if there's more options. So this has stopped being about the book, I suppose, but just a general shout out for like the independent industry. The more I've gotten older, like I had my own business at one point when I got out of college. Like I've gotten crotchetier as I've gotten older and just more independent everything to the degree that it's possible. Like that appeals to me, man. Like to counterpoint the Poppy Wars cultural point by just saying this doesn't feel superficial. At no point did I feel like the author was getting on Reddit and looking up factoids about Japan. There's especially with the language, the use of language here it's very Japanese in sort of the titles and the way they name things and the way they talk to each other, but it's also like a sidestep. Like they actually took the effort like to create these new titles, these new words, and it feels super genuine. There's an aspect of the culture, there's an aspect of the people who live in that culture that M.L. Wang gets that R.F. Kuang does not understand. At least in execution. Maybe one's just a much better writer than the other. And I'm going to talk about it bluntly because I don't care. You can call me whatever you want. Once we get to the other Poppy War books, it's going to get spicy. Join me next time we talk about books, or the next time I talk about this series, and we go in depth to the Dragon Republic. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to like author a quick short review, like a 10-minute review, and then I'm going to bring receipts. We are going to nitpick that, not nitpick, nitpick's a bad thing. Where are we going? We're going to go through a list of substantial complaints that I view as unacceptable. Character motivation, world building, pre-established facts, character arcs, the lack of proper development of character arcs, not knowing where to do with characters, just really weird plot motifs, completely tone deaf and inappropriate execution of an idea. It's gonna get spicy.